This is Abby. I just wanted to come on here with a disclaimer before this episode starts that in this episode, The History of Contraception, we will be discussing a lot of very heavy topics such as rape, abortion, contraception, death, potentially suicide, and racism. If any of those topics are at all problematic or difficult for you to listen to, we will not be at all offended if you want to skip this episode and go and listen to either one of our back catalogue or another episode in series 2. However, if you are staying with us, we hope you enjoy this episode, and if maybe you don't enjoy it, I hope you at least learn something. Welcome back to series 2 of HERstoryPod, the Herstory Project podcast. My name is Abby. And this is Jillian Darker. Yay! And this is series 2, episode 2. We are discussing the history of contraception in this episode. Before we get started, let's just remind everyone of who we are, what we're doing, and why we're here. We are the HERstory Project. I am the founder. Jillian is our co-editor-in-chief of our journal. And we are working to create platforms and spaces for underrepresented histories and their historians. We primarily give a focus to women's history, queer histories, and decolonial histories. Our website is free access, and you can go and check out our huge array of incredible articles for free at www.HERstoryPod.com. Our print journal is coming out with issue 3 very, very soon. And you can also go and follow us on social media at HERstoryPod and at HERstoryPod for even more free content. This is series 2 of the podcast. If you missed series 1, you can go back on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple and listen to every single episode. We are also working on getting them uploaded onto YouTube, and you can now follow us, follow the podcast on all of those platforms. It would be really useful as well if you are able to give us 5 minutes of your day to review, like, share, subscribe on whichever platform you are listening on. It is free for you and gives us just a little extra boost, which is really useful for growing both the podcast and the project. Without further ado, let's get on with this episode. So, like I said, we are talking about contraception today, and this episode was actually researched by one of last year's student researchers, Leela. So, thank you so much to her. Before we get started, I want to just reiterate that we will be discussing quite a lot of difficult topics in this episode, including racism, abortion, death, possibly murder, rape, and a lot of other horrible things. But I also want to give a disclaimer that as Jillian and I are historians who focus on European culture, this episode does have a very heavy Western focus. We're very aware that we do not have the knowledge or the experience to give a thorough and completely complex history of contraception on every single continent of the globe. So we are aware that that is a kind of whole. We would love to have potentially an expert in Asian contraception, in the history of Asian contraception, the history of contraception in other parts of the globe, come on and we will interview you and find out even more. But in this episode, we are focusing on the kind of Western world and the history of Western medicine. Because of that, and because that is the kind of history that we're looking at, there is a lot of emphasis at various points of this episode, which will focus on race, racial discrimination, and particularly the treatment of Black slaves. So again, if that is not something you want to hear about or you're in a place to hear about, I will pinpoint the parts of the episode, so you are free to skip that part or skip the episode completely. I think that's all the disclaimers that we have to make. So let's get started. First of all, basic question, Jillian. What is contraception?
So contraception really refers to sort of any method to prevent impregnation, so the fertilization of an egg in utero.
So could I say that my raging rampant lesbianism is a form of contraception?
Sort of. Contraception,
Cool.
however, today we do tend to think of it as going beyond just preventing pregnancy. So we also think of contraception now when it comes to preventing the spread of sexually transmitted diseases as well. And we'll actually talk a little bit in this episode about how those histories intertwine at different points.
Okay, amazing. So when I think of like the history of contraception, I'll be honest that my brain first actually goes to like the 60s, the invention of the pill, the kind of invention of kind of rubber condoms, because they did exist before this. But contraception definitely didn't just spring into existence in the 20th century. So how far back can we actually trace methods of contraception?
We can trace methods of contraception all the way back through to the ancient world. So we have examples from ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Greece of different types of contraception methods that both women and men were using. And what's interesting is, as you might be able to imagine, lots of the sort of forms of contraception in the ancient world revolved around the use of sort of different herbs, or foods or things that you would sort of consume to prevent pregnancy.
So can you give us a little bit more detail in kind of like the ancient world and what people did? Was it just like pulling out? Did they lather some rosemary on their vulvas and hope that that stops the sperm getting through? What happened?
Kinds of fun things that were happening in the ancient world.
The
A
last
lot.
one I want to point out, I have just made up on the spot. So I really hope no one like clips that and uses that as a way to like say this is what people did in ancient Egypt.
The best part is that it's not wholly far off. So what we know of ancient Egyptian sort of contraception methods. So one recipe that we have in the record is for pessaries. I'm definitely not saying that correctly.
No, I think that's how you say pessaries.
Love that. And those were made of a lovely, lovely combination of crocodile dung, honey, and sodium bicarbonate that was then inserted up as a barrier method. Now, unfortunately, what we know today is that that mixture was actually alkaline, so more likely than not, it promoted the flow of sperm through the body rather than prevented it.
Also, like, sorry, but you're shoving crocodile dung. That's just like asking for like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
It's
I mean, at least the
interesting.
honey is antibacterial. Like the honey is good, I guess. At least it's not going to hurt you.
Would be needed for the crocodile dung, one would think, as a marriage point.
So they would like put it inside their vaginas, I assume. Not going to shove that inside a penis, and then have sex. And was the idea that it would like block?
Yeah, so the idea was
It would
that
like create a block for the
it would create a
penis
block,
to
and
not.
the idea was that sort of specific mix of ingredients would help kill the sperm.
Okay.
Admittedly, were the ancient Egyptians calling it sperm? Probably not. Probably not.
I wonder what they were calling it.
Well, we know in Greece at least, so it raises a really good question, right, as to how the ancient world was viewing the body and viewing these reproductive processes. Like Abby stated at the start of this episode, our sort of specialty is the Western world. So I can speak on this from sort of an ancient Greek perspective. So it's really in ancient Greece and ancient Rome that we develop these ideas about the male and female body that persist all the way through the early modern period, so really into the 1600s. And there were medical theories popularized first by Aristotle and then later by Galen. And the idea was that men and women only had one sex. So the male, which was the perfect version of that sex, and female, which was the imperfect version of the sex. And so
So true, bestie.
I mean, and so the idea was, when you talked about sort of female anatomy, female reproductive anatomy, it was thought to just be an inverted version of the male. So the cervix or the vagina, for example, was referred to as an inverted penis, which I think is just really fascinating as a way to view the body.
I'm also like fascinated by the fact that it's like the cervix for them that is the inverted penis, when the clitoris is right there, and it is actually external, and it is also like, so if you don't know anything about biology, here's the tiny bit I learned in GCSE biology. Every embryo is originally a female embryo, and the clitoris is what will either stay as a clitoris or eventually develop into a penis. So it's fascinating that they don't make that connection. I wonder if it's because all of these kind of Greek philosophers who were coming up with ideas about sexuality and gender were gay men. So they just didn't have any idea what the female body looks like.
Yeah. And that was
Uh,
genuinely a real part of it, right? So for sort of most of the ancient world and across early modern Europe, birth was something that happened largely in female-only spaces. You wouldn't necessarily have a male doctor present at a birth. You'd have a midwife, and that midwife was likely trained by the midwife before her. So traditions were passed down, knowledge was passed down from women to women. So what we have in the historical record really is just the male scientific idea of the body. That doesn't mean, though, necessarily that was directly impacting birthing practices at the time, because that was something that was considered a woman's knowledge.
what was their contraception like?
So their contraception was called silphum. So silphum was a type of plant. It was a giant fennel plant that became popular as a form of contraception. This is something that different.
How did that work?
Different. It was something that was ingested.
Okay, I did think it's a giant fennel. I can kind of see how that might work as sort of a natural shaped but also rubbish condom. But ingesting it, I guess, makes the same amount of zero sense.
So it was considered an effective contraception method at the time. We don't think that it was necessarily likely that effective, but it actually, as a plant, became extinct in the 1st century AD. So we don't have...
Is that because they were using it so much?
You never know. Another interesting sort of method of contraceptive, this is something that definitely is passed down through sort of the old wives' tale tradition, and actually persisted. We have some accounts of this persisting as birth control method up until World War I, was the idea that you could also prevent pregnancy by drinking blacksmith water. So this was the water that blacksmiths cleaned their tools in.
So it's dirty, metallic water.
Mm-hmm. So the key here is that water often contained lead. And lead
so they were just giving themselves lead poisoning.
So they were giving themselves lead poisoning. And if they did have a fetus in utero, what that was likely to do was terminate that pregnancy. But again, interesting, I think, that clearly there was some efficacy to this because it was a practice that persisted for so long.
Okay. Fascinating. Disturbing.
Yeah.
Can you give us any more idea of kind of other types of contraception in the ancient world?
Yes. So we've got a couple of different ones. We have, this is my favorite. I'm going to be really honest with you. This comes from ancient China. Women were advised that in order to prevent pregnancy, you could swallow 16 tadpoles fried in mercury immediately after sex.
Okay, right. Mercury is poison.
Yes, correct. Once again. Similar to...
So it would have, I mean, effectively what they're causing here are abortions, if anything. But I'm also pretty sure that mercury causes liver and kidney damage.
Yeah, we're looking at basically like morning after pill alternatives, right? But these
Yeah.
alternatives were toxic,
Mm.
both mother and cell bundle.
Oh, anything else that we know of?
So we know that in ancient Sumatra, another sort of popular form of contraception was the opium poppy plant, where the seed pods or flowers were inserted into the body. I will let you take a wild guess where those were likely inserted into.
Oh, the belly button, obviously.
Yes. We also have the first mention of a female condom, which comes in 300 BCE from Greek literature. So again, there is a sense that sort of similar to early barrier methods that were being used in ancient Egypt, ancient Greeks had developed some sort of other barrier method, likely not using crocodile dung, but I'm sure equally industrious in its in
I
its
hope
material.
I hope as few ancient women as possible were shoving crocodile shit inside their vaginas.
I'm concerned. I live in fear.
Um, Before we kind of carry on, I want to ask how much, if any, if you know the answer to this, but how much did kind of people generally at this period understand kind of menstruation, female body cycles? Did they understand that there was a time of the month, ovulation, where it was more likely and kind of a better time for a woman to get pregnant?
So there definitely would have been an understanding, particularly amongst women, about a lot of these concepts. So lots of different Asian cultures, for example, have specific rituals around the week in which a woman would menstruate. You can see this, for example, in certain versions of Jewish culture, early modern and ancient sort of Jewish cultures, where a woman would sort of live in isolation for the week of her menstruation. She would go through a cleansing ritual and then come back into society. So there is a sense that there was sort of an understanding around menstruation. Now, what I couldn't tell you from my own knowledge is how closely that was linked to understandings of sex and reproduction. What we do know that I think is quite interesting is that there was a conception that both men and women in the ancient Greek and Roman sort of tradition, that both men and women sort of, and I don't unfortunately know the names that were used for these processes back then, but it was believed that sort of both men and women produced a form of semen, and that both of those were necessary for the production of child. And what that meant in the ancient mind was that a woman had to orgasm in order to
Ah.
sort of have a child, in order to fertilize that egg. Right, that was key, to the point that you can find lots of manuals, particularly in early modern Europe. So, sort of from 1450 to 1600, that are specifically instruction manuals for men on how to bring a woman to orgasm so that she could get pregnant.
Remember, I remember reading a book near the start of my undergrad, so oh God, 8 years ago now, about women's health in early modern England. It was the idea that a kind of hysterical woman, a mad woman, a sad woman, a depressed woman, could be cured by having an orgasm. And there were other parts of that kind of chapter to do with kind of childbirth and conception, etc. And the reason it all tied in together was because the midwife was brought in to administer pleasure to these women, because it was like the only way that they could achieve an orgasm. Um, and I know what you mean. I feel we've lost skills as a society. Um, I'm not saying decent sex would like cure depression, but I do think it would probably help quite a lot of people.
Marriages would be happier, the divorce rate would drop. I've got a couple predictions overall.
We've talked about ancient China, ancient Sumatra, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. I have two questions. Firstly, what about the Romans? And then my other question is who was using these forms of contraception? Was it married women? Was it 16-year-olds who were sneaking out at night and getting a cookie from the boy down the road?
In terms of, we'll start with ancient Rome.
Hmm.
So you sort of see a similar mix of things that were happening in ancient Greece. So you have sort of barrier methods or early forms of sort of a female condom.
Hmm.
These usually would have been some kind of sort of block or plug, something like honey, olive oil, mixed together.
I mean, that just sounds like quite an effective lube.
A little bit.
I was reading, I have a book called 3,000 Kisses. It's a little bit like an anthology of queer ancient stories. And there is literally one point where it talks about how olive oil was so popular in Rome and Greece because of the amount of anal sex that was going on.
Good.
So
That,
I mean I'm glad these women were lubricated.
yeah. We do have, again, some evidence of early use of condoms, typically made from animal bladders or intestines. Unclear, I'll be completely honest, if those were female or male condoms. And then my personal favorite, there was a Roman gynecologist, Soranus, who advised holding one's breath during sex and sneezing or jumping backwards 7 times immediately after to prevent pregnancy, which, I'm going to be honest, sounds foolproof.
Okay.
Jump
It
the sperm
really,
out of the body.
yeah. I mean, it really reminds me of how I'm pretty sure that's one of the methods that Queen Victoria used. She would jump up and down in her bed after having sex with Albert because she didn't want any more babies. Spoiler alert, Victoria had 9 children, so I don't think it worked very well. Um, but I think that's an idea that sticks around, that you can like dislodge the sperm um and shake it out, I guess. And who was using these methods generally? Like obviously there's so many different kind of societies here, so I don't expect there to be kind of one simple answer, but who who would be using this contraceptive methods?
It's a great question, and to be honest, I'm not positive from a historical record perspective. But given that most of these sort of ingredients or remedies that we've talked about were likely things that women could more or less find around, it's likely that most women were probably using these types of contraception methods at some point across their lives.
Mm.
Um, we can guess that likely they would have been more popular amongst certain groups. So sex workers, for example, probably would have had much more familiarity and knowledge with some of these methods than, say, your typical Roman housewife.
Hmm.
That being said, just as we see sort of across the medieval and early modern period as well, a woman who is desperate to prevent a pregnancy will find their way to these contraceptive methods.
To speculate a little bit, I think in this instance, in a lot of instances, to be honest, on this podcast, is probably fair enough, because like realistically we know now that most women at some point have used contraception, and I think in these cases is specifically for the kind of prevention of pregnancy. But what time period are we talking about right now? Like what does that mean when we say the ancient world?
Well, in this context, we're going sort of as far back as 1850 BCE, all the way sort of up to the 1st century AD, to the fall of the Roman Empire. So it's a really long stretch of time. And as we've sort of already touched on, really sort of geographically diverse as well in terms of sort of the differences between contraception, for example, in ancient Egypt versus ancient China versus ancient Greece.
Yeah. And I think something that's maybe worth kind of pointing out is that often what I hear about when it comes to sexuality, sex, and gender in terms of kind of archaeological studies and ancient Sumatra, kind of ancient Mesopotamia, etc., often what we hear about are kind of fertility emblems and things that were used to help women get pregnant. We might not be experts about it, but there is clear evidence also of people trying to avoid fertility and avoid conception. From as early as we have examples of people trying to get pregnant, we have examples of people trying to not get pregnant. Moving on to medieval, early modern sort of period. So medieval, kind of starting around like the 1st, 2nd century, is known as the Great Millennium. Now, again, I think often what we hear about in this period is how people use fertility emblems like those of Frigg in kind of Norse mythology, Venus, loads of things like that to try and get pregnant. But we know that wasn't the case. I think, well, we're not going to kind of touch too much on this because I know we've got a lot of early modern stuff to kind of go over, but just to give like a couple of examples, people did kind of carry on with the same methods of contraception as they had in the ancient world. In terms of kind of science and medicine, there isn't too much progression.
We're still really locked into Galen. Anything he says, we're taking as Bible.
Yeah. There isn't really much kind of like scientific progression. There obviously is some. I don't want to say that this was the Dark Ages. It wasn't. There was progression, but understandings of the women's of a woman's body, of the female body, of female anatomy, of pregnancy, conception, and kind of contraception, there wasn't really too much which is worth remarking on from what we know from our research. But when we get on to a bit later, comfortably the early modern period, we start to get some really fucking weird stuff going on. Now, I'm going to give some headlines and then I'm going to hand over to you. So, in this period, we have people making condoms out of pigs' bladders and pigs' intestines and lubricating them and making them damp and ready for usage, reusage with many different men by dipping them in milk. We have people ingesting animal testicles. We have kind of a development of a long-standing practice throughout the medieval period of brewing our own alcohol and using it to effectively poison ourselves in order to avoid conception. We have the kind of start of people bathing in very, very hot water to kind of trigger a miscarriage. And we also have quite a few examples of noble women throwing themselves down the stairs when they get pregnant with the wrong man's baby. So Jillian, I firstly want to ask, what the hell was going on in Canada?
Canada, they're just so fun. They're doing a lot of stuff up there. So the Canadians, right? The big trade in Canada, worth noting at the time, is beaver fur. That's why the French are there. That's why the English want to be there, right? It's all about the beaver. Funny. Think about it for a second. It becomes funnier. Beaver was the big trade, right? Lots of beaver lying about. Someone thought, I know what we could do with some of the spare bits of the beaver. So what they started to do was they would take the beaver testicles, dry them out, grind them up, and mix them into a strong homemade alcohol, which became known as moonshine. Moonshine, mind you, still a thing in North America, no longer made with beaver testicles. I think it's worth pointing that out. But it was thought that this, if drank again after sex, could prevent pregnancy. It did not. But it was kind of a fun thought. Industrious. We were using all the parts of the beaver.
That is about a good. That feels to me like about as good a justification as when vegans are faced with the well, if we wear leather jackets, then I'm using all the parts of the cow. Like, it feels a little bit like, okay, but you could just not do that.
Yeah. What if we didn't?
What if we just didn't do that at all? Okay. I don't know what to say.
Where are you going from that one?
I want to ask, in this period, what changed in terms of like scientific understandings of the female body, of pregnancy, of how conception even happened?
Yeah, I mean, the early modern period is really where you see the foundations of the modern medicalization of the female body. So like we mentioned before this, birth and sort of everything surrounding birth was really considered a woman's knowledge. It was something that was handled by midwives, and men sort of had very little involvement in it. This starts changing actually sort of across the Renaissance period. And one of the reasons that this starts changing is because artists become obsessed with anatomically correct bodies. They start digging up bodies, dissecting bodies, creating really detailed anatomical drawings of bodies. But what this started to do was it sort of, in a roundabout way, helped normalize dissection as sort of a medical process, as a learning process.
Okay.
And you start to see the dissection and documenting of female anatomy in a way you really haven't before by male scientists. A great example and a really big sort of turning point in medical history in the Western world is the publishing of Helsai Hook's Microcosmographia. This is one of the first books that stops referring to sort of the one-sex model and actually splits men and women into two distinct sexes, right? So Hook no longer refers to the cervix as an inverted penis. He names it the cervix. And we get a conception of female anatomy and female reproductive anatomy as something that's really distinct from men in a way that was not conceptualized before, right? Because it was just an inverted penis. So views of the body are changing rapidly in this period. Or what accompanies this is that medicalization of the birth process. And it's the French who are often the French royal family who are often pinpointed as one of the main culprits in this process because they're some of the first monarchs to bring male doctors into a queen's birthing chamber. This is where you see changes in birthing practices as well, right? So traditionally, when birth was an activity that was organized by a midwife, in most Western European cultures, women tended to give birth either standing or on what's called a birthing stool, which sort of supports you in a half standing position. And that was so gravity could help you do some of the work, right, of delivering the baby. Women don't start delivering babies on their back until the French monarchs start medicalizing this practice. A, because a male doctor thought that was best, but B, also, all of the French royal births were observed. And you couldn't see as much if the woman was standing, but you could see much more if she was on her back, laid down in the bed.
There is a really good depiction of this kind of birthing scene and how that might have looked like. Obviously, very dramatized in the first series of Marie Antoinette, the show on BBC. Now, the show overall is entertaining, but not exactly like accurate. But that birthing scene is pretty much exactly as Jillian described. It is Marie having to give birth in front of the entire court. Her legs are hoisted up. It's a super uncomfortable position. Um, it's just absolutely horrible,
We
and
can
everyone's watching it.
And you can juxtapose that really clearly to The White Queen on Stars, the BBC, which is adapted from Philippa Gregory, where you see Elizabeth Woodville give birth standing, surrounded only by women. And I think that is a really great depiction of sort of what changes with the
Mm.
medicalization of the body. Um, and we see a direct correlation with the rise of both maternal and infant mortality rates as a direct result of that. Men did not know what they were doing. And they wholly disregarded the acquired verbal sort of almost midrash tradition of midwives, right? So,
Yeah.
so much of that knowledge was not necessarily lost, but not recorded.
It yeah, it was also villainized in a really strong way. Midwives are one of the and wise women who would probably now have been excellent doctors and nurses, um, kind of your local woman in villages and towns who you would call upon if you were pregnant and you had nausea and you wanted a specific kind of herb or potion to kind of help with morning sickness. If you had a cut or a graze, you would go to these people. They would help you. They would heal you. Um, these were often the women who would be accused of witchcraft, especially in kind of the late 16th century and then parts of the 17th century. And often this was because these were the women who would be relied upon and called upon to get a woman through childbirth, to heal a sick child. And if that woman didn't make it through childbirth, if that child died for whatever reason, because these women weren't actually miracle workers, if a plague happened, something like that, people would often want someone to blame. And then when kind of witchcraft hype was happening, um, who better to blame but the kind of often weird spinster or elderly woman who kind of boiled potions and knew far too much. Who else could you kind of blame and be like, she's a witch? So and men and medicalized men, kind of intelligent men, would also target these women for the same reasons. They would be like, you have knowledge that I don't understand, and I'm a man, so I can't be wrong. So a lot of that knowledge was kind of not just lost, but villainized in a way. And that really led to such a long, long history of unnecessary death.
I think that also leads us on to it in terms of sort of differing views of contraception between the ancient and sort of early modern period. This is where you do start to see sort of an increasing villainization in some ways of contraception. Um, well, right, we're in that Christian ethos now of sort of having a family and having children, particularly in a Protestant setting. That is the most godly thing a woman could do.
Absolutely. There's this really heightening idea that a woman's body almost belongs not just to her husband, not just to her father, not just to the men who would have always owned her, but almost like it belongs to the church, like it belongs to society. And it is that woman's duty to reproduce at the detriment of her health and her own body. And I think that's what we really see throughout this period is this idea, this complete dehumanization almost of the female body.
I think it's interesting because you can see this in some of the developments, sort of the big developments in birth control that happen in this period, right? So one of the biggest developments that you see in the early modern period is one of the first sort of modern condom prototypes. Um, So this was designed by Gabriele Falloppio. What a name. In 1564. So he created a linen sheath coated in lotion.
Okay.
Do what you want with that. He trialed it, and I think this is important. Scientific method. He was rigorous. I'd love to know how this went down. It was trialed on over 1,000 men.
A lot of men for 1564.
But was he there? Was he recording? How was the trial? I have so many questions about this trial process.
My question is, did they actually, or did they just say they did?
There's a lot of questions there. What I think is the most fascinating part of sort of the development of the condom was it had almost nothing to do with preventing pregnancy. So we've talked in the beginning about how sort of contraception, when we think about it, is primarily sort of used to prevent pregnancy, but we also think about it now as key in STD prevention. That was how Gabriele Falloppio came up with the idea for the condom. It was about preventing syphilis. So this is a period of time where you see a huge increase in syphilis cases across Europe. And Gabrielle's father had died of syphilis when he was only 10 years old. And so his whole point in developing the condom had nothing to do with preventing pregnancy and everything to do with preventing the spread of syphilis between particularly sex workers and men. Sex workers were often the ones who were blamed for the spread of syphilis.
Which, and I don't want to blame them, but when you've got half the city dropping into a brothel and half of them already have syphilis, it's very easy for that poor girl to also then get syphilis and pass it on to the other half of the city. Please can I ask a question about Gabriele Falloppio?
Fallopian tubes are named after him.
Yes, okay.
So he
how? Because he's invented condoms, and we're naming a part of the female anatomy after him.
He is. So he did also write a couple of medical treatises about sort of sex in particular and reproductive anatomy. So he was interested in it, even though that isn't sort of why he developed the condom. And he originally named the fallopian tubes uteri tuba. Tuba translates to trumpet in Latin.
Yeah, they kind of look like trumpets.
English doctors apparently misread tuba as tube, which is how we get that part of the term for, and gave it his name rather than calling it uteri. What was it? Uteri tuba. So that's how we got fallopian tubes.
Okay, so in all fairness, not his fault.
Interesting, but yeah.
Very interesting. Also interesting, I guess, that he is here looking at female anatomy. So we have kind of clear evidence here that people are looking at female anatomy from a scientific perspective.
Yeah. This is sort of the real rise of fascination with women's bodies.
Okay. Let's stay on condoms for a second, because they weren't all weird linen sheaths.
No, some of them were pig intestines.
Yeah. I know that there was like a fairly rampant trade for condoms. And I guess they were often called kind of sheaths more than condom. But I know it also came from the Latin word for receptacle. Some of my favorite things that I want to point out are how they were made and how they were utilized. So animal intestines or bladders would be like stripped apart. Almost, yeah. It's sometimes even like they would take like this whole tube of animal intestine, bearing in mind that like that could be like meters long, and they would just like chop 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 into certain pieces, and they'd tie one end, and they'd, I guess, clean it I don't want to think too much about that, but I hope they're washing all the kind of animal stuff off. And what they would then do is around the bit that wasn't tied off, that you would kind of use to slip on, they would put some ribbon in it, basically. So then the idea was that you pull on the condom. You've got the knot at the end, so that's obviously like at the tip of the penis. What's worse, the actual information or the fact that I'm the one telling you about it?
Both.
And then at the top of the shaft,
Go for it. It's fine.
the top of the penis, they would like tie the little ribbon and then they'd go at it. But it gets worse. Firstly, these were designed to be reused. Already the efficacy is like very minimal, but the fact that they're meant to be reused, it's a little bit like, okay, guys, what are we on here? They weren't exclusively reused by the same man, because brothels and sex workers didn't trust men to provide their own contraception. So they would keep condoms in their brothels of many, many forms. And it was kind of, and often by the kind of late 16th, definitely by the late 17th century, it was actually a requirement to wear them because of the spread of syphilis. And if you didn't have one, you would be provided with one. So God knows how many men had worn this before you. It gets worse, because if you don't know much about animal intestines or bladders, that's effectively like skin. And what happens is that they would dry out. So they wouldn't be very, like, when they were wet, moist, they could be stretched and secured nicely. But when they're dry, they're basically solid. Just like imagine tapping it on a table, it could break. So what they would need to do before using it is soak it in liquid. And the most common liquid to soak it in was milk. Now, the efficacy of these was not great. A lot of STDs were still spread, and a lot of pregnancies still happened because you've got a pig's bladder wrapped around your penis, dipped in milk. Imagine the smell.
I don't want to. I really don't want to.
So that was kind of the development of the condom, and that's kind of how it existed for a really, really long time, until what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and the kind of invention and popularity of rubber. But there's a few things to get to before then, isn't there? What would people do if they didn't have condoms?
If they didn't have condoms, I mean, there was always your classic. There was the pull-out method, still going strong to this day. Shouldn't be, but is. You had your blacksmith water still. There were sort of different herbal concoctions that were developed over the time and in different places that sort of acted as a sort of form of morning after pill, similar to that blacksmith water. Usually they were toxic in some way, again, to the mother as well as the baby. My absolute favorite, however, and perhaps one of the weirdly most effective methods, if it was actually used and not just passed down to us through story and lore, is the method of prevention popularized by Giacomo Casanova.
Okay, Casanova. This could be great, or this could be terrible.
It's a little bit of both. I'm gonna set your expectations from the start. Casanova encouraged his lovers to use a half-squeezed lemon as a form of contraception.
As in, question, like, cut it in half and then squeezed a bit, or completely squeezed?
So cut it in half, squeeze it a bit, scoop out the rest of the pulp, So there should still be lemon juice sort of soaked into the rind, but the actual pulp should be removed.
Okay.
Insert it as if it was a cervical cap or a blocker. So again, we're talking as a form of female condom here. And use it as a blocker. Now, what's fascinating about this method is that it worked quite well, even though we'd want it not to, because lemons are so high in acidity that the pH level kills the sperm.
I imagine it killed a lot of things.
The burn. I can't imagine the burn, but apparently it was quite an effective. It was quite an effective female condom. And it's kind of like, I just love that it comes from Casanova. I just love that that's how we could tie him into this episode.
That would make penetration to be like the most pleasurable experience for women. Can't imagine it would be the most pleasurable experience for men either.
And the top of that lemon's pointy.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd wanna, I don't know. I wasn't there. Thank God.
Every day I learn something new as a historian that makes me go, I'm very glad I was born in the 21st century and I have TikTok and drugs. Because what the hell? Please tell me it gets better.
It does. So, I mean, that's one of the last sort of great contraceptive methods of the early modern period. As you move into the modern period, there's a couple of sort of big developments which sort of really revolutionize contraception. So one of those, as we've sort of hinted at before, is in 1839, vulcanized rubber is invented.
What the hell is vulcanized rubber?
Vulcanized rubber is basically like a stretchy form of plastic. It's almost the predecessor to latex. And it was a new way to make condoms, right? That did not involve soaking animal bladders in milk.
I think it's great. I forgot to say they would literally have like models like to shape them on. So they would basically have like these giant dildos in their houses. They were often just made by like normal women as well and like sold for like a profit. Brothels made and sold them, and they would have like this wooden dildo and that's what they shaped them on. I forgot to say that bit, but I think that's one of the best bits.
I hate that.
You're welcome.
You continued to develop across time. So by the mid-1930s, you have liquid latex. This makes condoms much stronger. And also then, as a result, much safer in terms of having sort of less chance of that condom breaking. And eventually in the 90s, you have the development of polyurethane condoms, which are what most condoms tend to be made of today. This is a bit thinner than latex. And it tends to be slightly less affected by heat or lubricants, making it a little bit more durable than those liquid latex condoms used to be.
And they're safe for people with latex allergies.
The development of condoms goes up and up. Now, when you want to talk about the development of gynecology and contraception, however, in the 19th and 20th century, this is where the history of contraception becomes something really quite dark.
Okay, I'm gonna put a disclaimer here for anyone who's listening. From this point on, the conversation is going to get a lot heavier. Until now, we've joked around quite a bit about what people would do to avoid getting pregnant. From this point on, it starts to get dark. Now, inevitably, we will still joke around about certain things, but we are obviously not going to joke around about the trauma and assault that was done on so many women's bodies. However, if you do not want to listen to any of that information, feel free to kind of skip to the end. I will also kind of bookmark and mark when we finish with this conversation, or just stop listening now. That is absolutely fine. So we have talked a lot about condoms and a lot about kind of what men can do to avoid pregnancy. Now, I've seen a few kind of tweets going around. They're not tweets anymore, whatever you want to call them, and like comments on threads and the angry feminist discord that I'm part of, obviously, of suggesting that all men should just have vasectomies because they're reversible. Um, but obviously, like, that's not going to happen. Obviously, the easiest thing to do is forcibly sterilize women, correct?
Yeah. And that's really what we did a lot of. And I think it's worth taking a moment here to not only say this. I think for a long time, feminists, particularly white feminists, wrote a very particular history of this period of sort of women's history and the history of contraceptive as this really positive upward narrative. Where there was this great progress. We really took a renewed interest in women's bodies. We developed all of these sort of contraception methods. And what was left out of that narrative until very recently was the fact that most of those contraceptive methods and most of those gynecological methods were developed and tested on enslaved women without their consent. And after that, after the end of enslavement, at least in a North American context, continued to be tested on Black women without their consent. And there's a really long and really painful history. And it's one of the reasons today that there tends to still be sort of quite a big divide when it comes to the feminist movement and conversations around contraception, because there isn't this acknowledgement of this sort of really sort of dual history here. I think it's worth acknowledging that from the start, and the fact that there is really a darker side to this history that's worth acknowledging and worth telling.
Yeah, it's a very dark history, especially when you kind of discuss kind of the history of Caesareans and C-sections as well, which was not named. I believe it's named after a myth that Caesar's mother had a C-section, but until I believe the early 20th century, to have a C-section was to kill the mother. Um, that did change, but that changed because of forced um forced non-consent assault on Black women's bodies.
You can see this in the history of gynecology in America. So for years, and even to this day, sort of the physician who's considered the sort of father of modern gynecology in America is a guy named J. Marion Sims. And he was lauded for such a long time for his developments. And he particularly is sort of one of these scientists who was really involved in developing cesarean surgery and cesarean techniques. And the way he did that was perform non-consensual surgery on pregnant enslaved women without anesthesia.
Because, again, it was believed that Black women didn't feel pain, I believe. Yeah.
It's really, really hard, I think, for us to even begin to conceptualize the horrors that enslaved women were subjected to in the name of modern science throughout this period. And it is, I think, impossible to tell a realistic story of the history and the development of contraception in this period without acknowledging that.
The intention of it was to find a way for the women to survive. Because, like I say, cesareans had been performed throughout history in various ways, and very few women had actually survived. So there are a couple of cases where it's believed that a successful cesarean, in that the mother survived, were kind of conducted, but they are like anomalous and also not 100% confirmed that they really happened. So what they were trying to do in this kind of repeated and horrible assault of these women was find a way to successfully perform a cesarean through which both mother and baby could survive. Without that, I will say, without those actions, a lot of women would probably still die every day. Um, and it's really difficult to understand that so many women since then have probably been saved by this medical procedure, which only exists in its modern form because of this continual abuse.
I think it really speaks to the complete and utter dehumanization of slaves in America. And it also speaks to, in some ways, why Blackness as a concept continues to be so distinct in the American ethos, right? There is no other racial group that was dehumanized to the extent that they were used as medical subjects for unethical and unchecked testing to this extent. But we see that history carry on. So even after the end of enslavement, when sort of you couldn't necessarily run unchecked, anesthetized surgeries on enslaved women, right? This was still happening to freed Black people. There is an incredible history of this happening at Johns Hopkins, which is one of the foremost medical institutes of the United States, up through the 1980s.
Wow, I had no idea about that. That's
If you
insane.
are interested in that, I highly, highly recommend looking up the story of Henrietta Lacks. It's one of the reasons we have any successful cancer treatments today is because they illegally stole her DNA after her death.
Oh.
Continued to test those medical treatments on her children who never received compensation. In fact, I think they only received medical compensation for that in the last 10 years. They are still using her DNA to this day in cancer treatments. There is an incredible history of medical abuse of Black individuals in the United States that is heavily, heavily tied to this history of contraception, and I think it cannot be separated.
I want to just pick up on something you said there. You specifically said there in the United States, and I want to say that that medical abuse is not only seen in the US. It is louder and more prevalent in the US, but it is seen in the UK and, to be honest, in any country which is predominantly white. Um, if not Black people, then I know that there's a history of kind of almost medical experimentation on Aboriginals in Australia. It's unfortunately a really common thing to happen. Um,
Leads us on then as well. So sort of after this period, what you then get, and there's coexistence of these movements. I don't want to sort of pretend that they're two completely distinct things, but at the same time, you have the increasing popularity of eugenics, right? Or this idea
yes.
that there are distinct and biologically categorizable differences between the races, and that through careful breeding, right, keyword there, you could create a genetically superior population. And because of this, eugenics plays a really big role then in contraception movements. And this is something else that really until recently was not acknowledged in any way. So two of the biggest activists for the birth control movement in the sort of late 19th and early 20th century in both America and the UK. So in America, I'm talking about Margaret Sanger. In the UK, I'm talking about Mary Stopes. These are huge figures. These are really popular figures. These are figures who were heroized for a really long time. They are both raging eugenicists who not only advocated for, but actively played a role in the forced sterilization of hundreds, if not thousands, of people of color. That's a lot.
There's I'm
That's a
just yeah, who did they target with these sterilizations? Not that that would anyway justify it, but who were the people who were kind of targeted by this?
So if we want to look at sort of a US context first,
Trust the American to give us a US context for
1881, Ohio is the first time we have a recorded sterilization of a woman in the continental US, which involved the blocking of her fallopian tubes. Just a quick sort of 20 years later, by 1907, one state over in Indiana, we have the first law signed permitting compulsory, keyword compulsory, sterilization, which was used to especially target women of color and Black women. Now, the words used in the actual law were confirmed criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles. The key phrase that was used to target women of color in particular were confirmed criminals, idiots, and imbeciles. So if you didn't meet a certain education level and that was up to interpretation, you could be subject to sterilization. If you broke any law, and again, that is subject to interpretation, and also worth noting that that includes breaking Jim Crow era laws around segregation, you could be subject to sterilization. These were also the sets of laws that eventually, in some cases, were also used to target homosexuality, male homosexuality early on. But by and large, these laws were used to target Black women, typically who faced some period of incarceration. Even after these laws are taken off the books, even today, in the American context, we still have lots of records of women being sterilized without their consent during birth processes. So women who go in to get cesarean sections and come out with their tubes tied, having never consented to that surgery, it is statistically, I think, almost 2 times more likely to happen to a woman of color than it is to a white woman. Right, so the history of this persists today in a lot of ways. I'll be honest, I'm slightly less knowledgeable about who this was used to target in a British context. But one could guess, based off of Britain's own colonial history and sort of patterns of immigration at this time, that this was likely probably used to target Southeast Asian and African immigrants, by and large.
From what I understand on the admittedly fairly brief history of eugenics that I studied, to kind of broadly state any non-white immigrant, I think a lot about the kind of East Asian kind of immigration that was that really increased in the kind of first half of the 20th century, but also kind of Black immigration, especially from the Caribbean islands, but also in the UK, as much as it was a kind of racial thing, it was also used to treat difficult white women, who were considered to be insane or stupid. I can't remember her name right now, but there was one young woman who was considered to be difficult. So they, I think, gave her a lobotomy and tied her tubes. It would also happen quite frequently to young people with mental health issues such as Down syndrome, or mental health conditions such as that.
Yeah. And I think what shows like Call the Midwife really speak to is sort of the perniciousness of a lot of these early clinics that women like Sanger and Stopes in a British context were founding, right? So Sanger founded Planned Parenthood, which to this day is one of the leading nonprofit organizations supplying contraception, particularly free contraception and abortive care to women. And Stopes founded a clinic first in South London that eventually moved sort of central and then expanded across the country. It was also one of the first clinics to collect data, systematic data on contraceptive use by women, which was quite important at the time. Both of these clinics were also participating in eugenics.
Planned Parenthood still exists, and from what I understand of America, it's one of the only consistent charities providing abortive healthcare. Stopes is so often talked about in such a positive light in terms of contraception in the UK. she was also actively participating in Nazism eugenics.
Yeah. And I think we now, as feminists, have to acknowledge the painful and dual histories of these organizations, right? We cannot celebrate them without acknowledging the direct and abundant harm they did to women of color. To do so does a disservice to all of us.
Absolutely.
And I think that's so important. I don't think that doesn't mean that we can't say that those organizations now potentially do good things that they haven't developed since then. I don't think it is the noose that we use to hang contraceptive care on, but I think we fall on our own swords if we try to ignore that history. Because it was real and because there is reparative work that has to be done in order for us to have a stronger coalition and to actually tackle these issues in a modern sense, right? We have to come to terms with the history and the harm that we did to others, right, for some kind of greater benefit that we might be receiving today. So much of these developments came off of the back of really, really horrific human experimentation on people who were completely dehumanized.
And it's constantly something that once you are aware, it becomes very, very difficult to forget.
As much as in a modern feminist consciousness, we really want to celebrate contraceptive as this really sort of great and freeing thing for women that gave them this newfound independence when it came to things like family planning. It does have this dual painful history for a lot of people. And we can acknowledge it and be conscious of it when we talk about it today.
That is mostly, I think, our discussion about eugenics, racial abuse, racism, rape, and surgery over. From now on, we're going to be talking about developments in medical care, such as intrauterine devices, the pill. If there is anything, I will put a disclaimer before we speak about it. So, with the hope that we might be able to lighten it up a little bit before the end of this episode, can you tell us about intrauterine devices?
Of course. Very impressed with your pronunciation of that because it's not going to be that smooth when I eventually try to say it.
Just say IUD. We've said it once.
We're just going to go with IUD. So the very first IUD was developed in 1909 by a scientist named Richard Richter, and it was actually made from silkworm gut.
Okay. Right.
But yeah, wait.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know what a silkworm is. Is it literally this like the worms that create silk? I did textiles A level, I should know that. That was on my exam, I'm pretty sure.
But yeah, very interesting, especially now considering that they're made of copper. They were later improved upon by this name.
Do you want me to pronounce it?
Ernst Gaffenberg.
That was such an American pronunciation.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
He was the one who added pure silver wire.
What's the idea for these kind of early IUDs that they would absorb the sperm?
So an IUD basically either works by releasing hormones, so it's either sort of embedded with hormones that are released specifically to thicken cervical mucus and thin the cervical lining, which makes it harder then for a fertilized egg to actually attach to your cervix and then grow into a fetus.
Mm-hmm.
Or it works if you have a copper IUD, right? So there are two types of IUDs. You can either have a plastic hormonal IUD or you can have a copper IUD. The copper IUD works specifically by releasing copper, which sort of creates a toxic environment and kills the sperm. So the idea behind the IUD development was to sort of insert something up into the cervix that would kill sperm, that would stop sperm from being able to travel all the way up to fertilize an egg.
So the first IUD by Richard Richter was made of silkworm gut. I assume with the idea that that would kill sperm. And then Grafenberg added silver wire.
With the idea being that that would have similar to copper, that would have the effect similarly of killing sperm, similar to why women were drinking blacksmith water, because it had these traces of metals and sort of low contents of lead in them that would create basically a hostile environment for sperm. IUDs sort of work along a similar concept.
Now, if I'm right, isn't silver like, I guess that's kind of the point, but isn't silver kind of toxic to ingest?
Right. That's why it wasn't used particularly long. So what was happening was the body was actually breaking down and ingesting that silver, which is bad. And that's why we switched to copper. So the body does not ingest copper in the same way.
Okay.
The metal IUDs were developed first. So we go from the silver to this sort of metal alloy combo that tends to be sort of copper dominant. And then in the 1960s, flexible plastic IUDs were created. These became known as the Dawkins shield. So this is what used hormones. So basically the plastic IUD released hormones over a period of time that increased mucus production and thinned the cervical walls to make it harder for a fetus to take hold. However, the Dawkins shield later became linked to pelvic infections and mortality due to the tail string. So most plastic IUDs will have a tail string attached to them to pull out. Copper IUDs sometimes also still have this. That can cause bacterial growth issues.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Something
does
to
that
be
not
aware
cause? Okay. I've also heard of people like pulling them out with their tampons
accident.
or like just pulling
Having
them
them
out by
pierced.
accident.
I've heard horror stories of people's, particularly the copper IUDs, piercing people's cervical walls.
I've also heard people like getting pregnant with like whilst on it and their baby comes out like holding it.
I've also heard that male medical doctors still won't prescribe painkillers or numb the area when giving an IUD insertion, which is one of the most painful procedures you can have by childbirth.
I literally couldn't have it done. I had a female doctor. I was numbed. I was given painkillers, and I literally couldn't have it done because it was so painful. So yeah, there's some TMI for our listeners.
I refuse to have one because I'm allergic to too many metals. It's the development of the IUD. It is a horrific little device, but it is about, at least today, it is considered about 98% effective. So it is one of our most effective birth control methods. And more than that, it's effective for up to 10 years, which, if you're comparing that to sort of one of the other most common birth control methods, I'm pointing to my arm because I have it, is Nexplanon, or the implant. That is only valid for 3 years. So you have to get that changed every 3 years in comparison.
Oh my God, I've never been so glad I'm a lesbian. Admittedly, admittedly, like in terms of like contraception, for its like most typical terms, this isn't really something I have to think about. And I think really glad about that. So I think that leads us on quite nicely to talking about hormonal contraception, which I think is the type of contraception that people now are most familiar with. And probably when people started listening to us and they were like, oh, they're talking about the history of contraception, they thought this is probably what we're going to talk about. Because this is admittedly, when I said we're going to do the history of contraception, what I thought about. It is the development of the use of estrogen and progesterone in pill form or in implant form or in the injection that people can get in their asses to prevent the kind of hormonal environment that your body needs to create in order to conceive a, a baby. A baby. So I'm going to tell you what I know and then you can correct me. How does that sound?
Go for it.
So what I know is that estrogen creates an environment in which the female body can create a bebe, can conceive and accept the bebe. The progesterone basically prevents that.
Google's going to tell you if you're right. Progesterone. Progesterone is produced in the second half of the cycle, so in your luteal phase. Progesterone prepares the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, for a fertilized egg. If pregnancy does not occur, progesterone levels drop, triggering menstruation. So progesterone is basically the hormone that controls menstruation itself. Whereas I think estrogen is more of your like general female hormone.
Okay. So progesterone is the hormone that's like high during the luteal phase. So it's the hormone that makes me want to commit murder. Okay. That's interesting because I was put on the progesterone only pill, and that kind of describes exactly how I felt for 6 months before I came off of it because I wanted to kill everyone.
Yeah. So it is estrogen that is responsible for female secondary sex characteristics and also for the thickening of the uterine lining, like in
So,
advance of your menstruation or your menstrual cycle.
okay, so they basically like control menstruation and create an environment to have a bebe. I need to stop saying that. I'm thinking too much about Catherine O'Hara now. R.O.P.
In peace.
Um,
But
so
yeah,
how does that work in terms of contraception then? Because if you need progesterone and estrogen in order to create a positive environment for a baby, I know that we have combined pills and progesterone only pills.
so progesterone is the hormone that can be used to stop ovulation and the thinning
Okay.
of the uterine lining. So because the level of progesterone in your body is sort of what kicks off that later phase of either menstruation or fetal development, depending on which way you've gone that month. By controlling the level of particularly progesterone in the body, you can start controlling when the body is ready for those things, right? So if you lower your progesterone levels in that luteal phase or raise them, I'm not a scientist, but if you do one or the other, conceivably, it is much harder for your body to conceive in that phase.
Yeah, I want to say here we are not scientists.
Scientists. Estrogen, I believe, is more used in the regulation of period symptoms. Because that is what controls things like the actual sort of thickening of your uterine walls and some of those other sort of fun knock-on things that you get around your time of the month.
Like wanting to kill everyone. So who found this out and thought that I'm going to use this weird ass chemical to stop my wife getting pregnant?
So it wasn't until the 1920s that we actually sort of understood what estrogen and progesterone was and what their role was in this sort of reproductive cycles. It then took another about 20 years for us to figure out how to actually create progesterone and estrogen. So it was in the 1940s when Russell Marker first purified progesterone, and he actually did this from yams or sweet potatoes, which I think is quite interesting.
Is that what yams are?
So he's the first one to start sort of developing a sort of prosthetic or a man-made version of progesterone that could then be used in these different contraceptive methods.
Through sweet potatoes? Wow.
In the 50s then, a scientist named Gregory Pincus is who actually developed the modern pill or spermicide.
I like spermicide.
Spermicide's sort of fun. And that was really, really heavily supported by Margaret Sanger. which I think is worth mentioning, at least in a U.S. context. So Margaret Sanger was a huge early proponent of the pill. It was something that was handed out for free. You could access through Planned Parenthood. So there is a connection through Sanger as well when it comes to the promotion of the pill.
Okay.
The first time that a combined pill is used, so a pill that has both estrogen and progesterone, is in 1956. It's a U.S. context. Guess where we've trialed that pill?
I'm going to guess, based on my knowledge of the US and your treatment of US territories, which are not US states, that you possibly trialed this in Puerto Rico.
Again, when it comes to the history of the connection between sort of eugenics and race and the history of contraception, this is another sort of case study in that. So we trialed the pill in Puerto Rico, and by 1960s, that first sort of oral contraception, dual contraceptive pill became available in the US, and that was called Enovid. The British then approved distribution a few years later via the NHS. And medical professionals sort of from this point forward became more and more involved in the distribution of contraceptive pills. Now, before this, it was something you primarily would have gotten at a clinic. So again, at a clinic like Stropes or at Sanger's Planned Parenthood, for example. But it's not something that you're necessarily going to be able to easily access through your doctor otherwise.
In a UK context, I think maybe a good reference point here is in the latest few seasons of Call the Midwife. The last 2 or 3 seasons, we've started coming into the 1960s. And one thing I know that they have started kind of looking at and making a very serious plot point is the legalization of abortion and also the introduction of the pill on the NHS, and how that kind of works among, obviously, Call the Midwife focuses primarily on a poor community in Poplar in London, and how that is used by women to improve their lives, really. So obviously it's not a documentary, but if you've watched Call the Midwife or you want to, the latest few seasons are a really good reference.
So in the US, particularly under this newest administration, there have been a couple of calls to make contraceptive wholesale illegal. And that's based off of a very specific version of Christian nationalism that was developed in the US across the 1980s. So we sort of see this continue today. But what sort of happens with the development of the pill, so it comes out in the 60s, it's sort of pushed quite broadly despite the religious backlash that it's met with. It's sort of really strongly supported in a lot of feminist circles. There's also quite a lot of backlash in a lot of feminist circles, particularly around the medicalization of the female body. So there is this tension from a really early stage. Across the later 60s, more and more risks are identified with birth control. So it was something that was pushed out quite quickly without sort of fully understanding the long-term effects potentially on women's health. So things like an increased risk of blood clots and strokes were identified in this period. Some early conceptions of things like mood swings are identified but not necessarily fully understood yet. This is something that sort of continually develops. So even still to this day, we're still trying to fully understand the long-term effects of contraceptive use on female bodies.
And
It's
I mean,
also...
I think most every woman I know has a story about contraception, about hormonal contraception. It's certainly not something that is perfect, is it?
Be a brutal system. It's also in the late 1960s that emergency contraception is first developed. So this is where you see the first sort of morning after pills that aren't things like blacksmith water or a semi-lethal dose of some combination of herbs or poisons.
Mhm.
And then in the 70s, you see sort of continual developments to the pill. So you see the first lower estrogen pills developed. You also see the first progesterone-only pills introduced. This is because some women, we found out later, can't actually have more estrogen introduced to their body. It can have some really negative health consequences. It can, yeah. it can do some really like I can't take birth control that has extra estrogen in it because it makes me crazy.
Mine, when I tried it, I had severe migraines with auras.
It's fun. It can do some fun things to your body.
It's really fun.
Um,
Um,
and again, yeah, we're continuing to sort of develop birth control. So you now have things like birth control injections. This tends to be, again, for people who can't take birth control with estrogen, so they tend to be progesterone-only injections. You have the implant, which tends to be the Nexplanon implant, which is a small hormonal-coated device that gets implanted into the arm. It lasts for about 3 years and sort of releases a continuous dose of progesterone across that period to prevent pregnancy. You have things like the coil, which is an and sort of similar sort of insertion device, but something that's inserted into the cervix rather than the arm. So you have sort of a continual development of these different birth control methods then across the later 20th and early 21st century.
so before we move on to the 21st century, we've got a couple new developments that I want to give a little bit of a shout out to. Can we just talk very briefly about what people would do when they were desperate? So, am I incorrect in saying that at some point women were using Coke, like Coca-Cola, as a douche to try and avoid pregnancy?
For a period of time, similar to the concept of taking a really hot bath after having sex to prevent contraception. That was something that for a while was considered. And then on sort of the most extreme end of that would then lead to sort of all of the very dangerous ways that one could then abort a fetus if you had
Mm.
gotten past that point of emergency contraceptive care. And this particularly sort of, I can speak to this from a U.S. context in a place that sort of abortion in particular was illegal until the 1970s, and then recently has been legalized again, right? This has huge implications for both maternal and infant mortality rates. And does have a direct tie to contraception as well.
What about kind of modern contraception? Because you mentioned that a lot of these kind of forms of, especially hormonal contraception, which other than condoms is probably like the most popular form of contraception generally. I think pretty much almost every single woman I know has a story, a horror story about one form of hormonal contraception or another. So I guess two questions. What is the sort of kind of contraception that people are using now? And why are we still using it when it causes so many problems?
There's two main types of birth control, I would say, that are used today. There are your barrier methods. So these are things like male and female condoms, spermicides, anything, as it sounds like, that is being used as a barrier. Or you have your sort of hormonal contraception methods. These are things that are typically taken by women. Now, what those hormonal methods are not doing is preventing the spread of STD. It is why most doctors or most reproductive health specialists will strongly, strongly encourage you to use both methods. So to make sure you're using some form of hormonal contraceptive and also a barrier method, because your barrier method is what's going to help prevent, depending on what type of barrier method you're using, condoms are the most effective for this, particularly male condoms, preventing the spread of STDs. I think that's really important to note, because I think condoms often tend to get written off these days, but they are extremely, extremely important in STD prevention.
Point to make. Point to make. Condoms are not only for heterosexual sex. If you are a gay man engaging in anal sex and you have not got tested and you have more than one partner, I mean, even then, please, please use condoms. If you have both got tested and you both consent, please feel free to bareback to your heart's content. But generally speaking, it's a good rule to use a condom. My second question is, why do we still use them? Especially hormonal contraception.
There's two things. One, there is still if you are a white woman, and I think it's really important to make that caveat, if you are a white woman, it can be incredibly difficult to get your tubes tied, which is one of the other sort of most effective forms of birth control that you can look at as a woman. It can be incredibly hard to convince a doctor of that. They will ask you things like, are you sure you don't want to have children one day? Are you sure you won't change your mind? If you are a woman of color, they might not even ask, which is the really, really sort of horrific fact and double standard there that exists. There aren't sort of hugely effective forms of male birth control either, besides a vasectomy. Good luck trying to convince most men to get a vasectomy before having some children of their own. And that
Even though they are reversible.
Yeah, fully reversible.
Vasectomies are fully reversible.
And that sort of leaves us in today's circumstances, sort of a mix of a lack of scientific development, but that's really undercut by the sort of social attitude and conception that getting pregnant is still a woman's fault. And this is something we can track all the way back. If we've looked at this history, we've told a really, really high proportion of these birth control methods are something that either women did or women took. There is one method that we've talked about in this episode that involves a man, and that is condoms. And that method was developed to prevent STDs, not pregnancy.
Because that wasn't a man's biggest problem.
The impetus on preventing pregnancy is still placed on a woman. And as long as that is the case, birth control will continue to be female-centric, regardless of how dangerous we know the side effects will be. Right, we can see that track the entire way across Western histories.
Yeah. It's a huge increase in women's bodily autonomy. It reduces mortality, like especially maternal mortality, obviously. And it gives people, especially women, so much more control, not only over their bodies, but over their entire lives. And I think it's then really hard to say that contraception is maybe a bad thing, because crucially it is positive, and it does have it gives opportunity, I think, effectively. But it is also fundamentally evil.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, at least in its current formulations, for sure.
So, in conclusion, why do you think the contraception is also healthcare for a lot of women, right? So many women at the age of 15 or younger are put on the pill because of their irregular periods or migraines or headaches or acne, etc., etc., etc. Why do you think that is? Is it just because it's just an easy way to be like, here, go away?
I think tackling that question requires us to think for a minute about the history of women in the medical disciplines, right? Historically speaking, when we ran tests, right, when we were testing a new medicine, you had to run trials. However, there was nothing that said you had to run those trials on men and women.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what doctors found out really quickly in running a lot of those medical trials was it's much more complicated to test on women, right? Our bodies change week by week, depending on where we are in our menstrual cycles. That makes testing on us much more difficult than a man who will more or less manifest the same symptoms on the same drug across a 1-month period, whereas we, as women, might manifest different symptoms month by month. What that meant is for most of our history, unless a drug had to be tested on women because it was for women, it wasn't. It just wasn't. Right? So when it comes to birth control and hormonal care, this is one of the only types of medicine that have been tested on women. So when it comes to all of these other issues women are having, we don't really understand it outside of menstruation and the connections to their cycle, because that's the only way we've really studied it scientifically. Now, that's not to say that there are not advancements being made. That's why today, when we have a lot of discussions around mental health, for example, you see a significant increase in diagnosis of, for example, female ADHD and autism, because we now understand that those manifest really differently in women than they do in men. Right?
Absolutely, can
What
attest to
we're starting to understand is that's not unique to those mental illnesses, right? It's the same for heart attacks. If a woman is having a heart attack, her symptoms are going to be quite different than the symptoms we're told about, right? That whole concept that you get pain in your left shoulder, that's something that tends to only happen in men, not women. Women get
Okay.
different symptoms in the lead up to a heart attack, right? But we're just learning all of this now.
Hmm.
And so I think one of the reasons that the pill is so commonly prescribed for such a large range of ailments is because there is now some concept that that has a hormonal connection. We know that hormones are affecting women's bodies months on months in quite a large manner. So we're just throwing the pill at everything because that's what we know as a medical establishment. It's laziness, right? Because what needs to happen is systemic medical testing of the assumptions that we have made as a medical institution in the West for the last 500 years, because those assumptions have only been tested on men. Until we test those assumptions on women, we will keep throwing the pill at everything.
Hey, well, this has been a very, light and breezy conversation for a Tuesday evening, hasn't it? Do you have any closing statements? What's one thing you'd like people to take away from this episode?
See the female body more, study women's anatomy more, reproductive system more. I think if there's one common theme throughout the history of contraception, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of women's reproduction and women's biography, women's biology. I think that's one key point to take away. And I think the other key point to take away is that you cannot tell just a happy story of the history of contraception.
Can't tell even partially a happy story of the history of contraception, I think, is what
It
we've established.
it is really important to acknowledge the painful dual history of contraception and that every so-called advancement we have today more or less came from a really horrific history of human experimentation, of dehumanization, of racialization. And to try to pretend today that those two don't coexist, I think continues to perpetuate a lot of the same issues.
Absolutely. Okay, we are going to leave it there for this episode. If you have any questions or if you wanted to add to this conversation, especially with regard, as we said at the start of the episode, to the kind of wider global history of contraception, please do leave a comment wherever you're listening or message us on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Likewise, if you have any suggestions for episode topics, please let us know. We would love to make what you want to listen to. Otherwise, we will speak to you next week about the history of the Enlightenment. Yay! Hopefully, we can just talk about Byron being a bit of a dick and less about institutionalized trauma just for a couple of hours.
Where a lot of that came from.
Oh, yes. Thank you for the reminder. Um, as I said at the start, if you do have a couple of minutes, please do go like, review, subscribe wherever you are listening, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram. I will be including a lot of information in the show notes, so if you have been in any way affected by what we've talked about in this episode, or if you want to go and learn more, you can go and check out the show notes, and there will be some information there for you. But other than that, thank you so much to listening to this episode of HERstoryPod, the HERstory Project podcast. It has been, as ever, a delight to speak to you, Jillian. And we are going to go now and sleep, I think, after the last couple of hours. Thank you so much,